Hello, and you're listening to the Behind the Fig podcast. I'm Fate, and today we have a special guest, Spicy. Would you like to? Well, I just introduced you, but would you like to introduce yourself and kind of talk about yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm Spicy Chestnut, better known as Spicy. I've been writing mostly Zelda fic for, I think about 3 or 4 years now. And today we'll be talking about the first fic I wrote for the fandom, and the first fic I wrote since I was 12 or 13. Love and Time of
Yeah, very exciting. It's a really, okay. All of our guests, of course, have gotten surprising. Not, oh my gosh, I can't talk. All of our guests have been featuring really good fics of theirs, but this one is just so extensive, such an epic, on an epic scale, a huge word count,
Appalling
huge,
word count.
uh, lots of words per chapter, and an amazing writing style. Spicy is going to be reading, chapter 1, I believe.
hmm
So, are there any trigger warnings?
So nothing too major. Just mentions of Zelda's mother, mentions self-esteem issues, and just general anxiety and fear.
Okay. So whenever you're ready, take it away.
They walked in silence. Golden light from the setting sun flooded the valley beneath Mount Lanayru. Birds chirped from budding tree branches, and a cool, gentle breeze tickled Zelda's cheeks. By all accounts, it was a beautiful spring evening. But in her soul, it felt like the top of the mountain. Cold. Numb. This was the last spring, her spring, the spring of Nehru, her patron goddess. Yet it seemed she was forsaken. She had spent every moment of every day dedicated to prayer. She had forgone so many of her own dreams and aspirations in the hope of unlocking this damned sealing power. All that effort and sacrifice, all for naught. Who knew how long they had left? Link hadn't said a word, and she hadn't bothered to look at him. Couldn't bear to, though she could hear his sure, steady footsteps following close behind her. His destiny had always been so sure. She knew in her heart she'd moved past her bitterness towards him. It wasn't his fault. He didn't choose for his destiny to be straightforward. Yet even still, she could feel resentment frothing inside her with this latest failure. Taking a breath, she closed her eyes and pushed the feeling away. Unfortunately, despair only took its place. Around them, snow had given way to tufts of green grass. They were nearing the east gate, marking the transition to Lanayru Road. She lifted her gaze to glance ahead, but the sight before her caused her stomach to plummet. There were all the champions, eagerly awaiting news that she'd unlocked her powers and their success in the coming battle was assured. Shame welled up inside of her, and she could feel herself beginning to tremble at the prospect of their despairing faces when she was forced to tell them it hadn't worked. She would disappoint them, just as she had her father, as she had the council, as she had herself. Would they perhaps even be angry? Scold her as others had? Clenching her hands into fists, she willed her arms to stop shaking and focused on maintaining a steady gait. Her sandaled feet echoed on the cobblestones as she approached the uneasy group, unable to meet their eyes. Daruk was the first to approach her. His face was drawn, anxiety etched all over his features despite his attempts to hide it. His bushy white beard rustled when he spoke. "Well, don't keep us in suspense. How'd everything go up there on the mountain?" He always was straight to the point. Zelda could feel the shaking return to her limbs and stared forward blankly into the distance. She wanted to say something encouraging, wanted to allay all their fears and be the leader she was supposed to be. But shame and failure gripped her throat, and she couldn't will herself to speak. Instead, she could only sigh breathily in defeat, shaking her head. To her surprise, Daruk's jaw dropped, shock and desperation overtaking his expression, however brief. Oh, goddess, it was worse than she'd feared. He'd actually had faith in her. He'd truly believed she could do it. She wanted to cry, wanted to curl up into a little ball and pretend none of this was real. Why? What had she done so wrong? Clenching her fists tighter, she schooled her expression and swallowed the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. No matter her inclinations, despair was unbecoming of a princess. A heavy silence descended upon the group at her answer, or rather, lack of it. Rivali was the first to break it, though his words offered no comfort. So you didn't feel anything? No power at all? With as raw as she already felt, the hint of accusation in his tone hit her like a slap to the face. Perhaps she deserved it. Their survival depended upon her, and her continued failure was risking everyone's lives. Zelda clasped her hands before her, chancing the briefest of glances in his direction before bowing her head and answering softly, deferentially, "I'm sorry, no." Though she'd tried so hard every day of her life, though she'd given everything she had, clearly it wasn't enough. She wasn't enough. Everyone here had put in their time, put in the effort. Everyone here was a champion, ready to fight the Calamity. Everyone except her. Urbosa's firm, authoritative voice cut through the fog of despair, and she raised a hand to her hip for emphasis as she spoke. "Then let's move on. You've done all you could. Feeling sorry for yourself won't be of any help." Turning towards the mountain, bracelets jingling, she gestured with her head in the direction of the peak. "After all, it's not like your last shot was up there on Mount Lanayru. Anything could finally spark the power to seal Ganon away. We just have to keep looking for that thing." Urbosa's words helped restore some small sliver of hope within Zelda. Her argument was that of simple logic, yes, but she suspected Urbosa knew that that was what she needed most in that moment. To be reminded that this was a task like any other, one to keep working on until it was achieved. Zelda replied softly, but more firmly than before, "That's kind of you, thank you." Mipha briefly glanced at Link, standing just behind the princess, whose gaze was serious and inscrutable, before speaking slowly in her soft, gentle tones. "If I may..." Her voice was much kinder and lacked the judgment of Rivali's. For the first time since coming down the mountain, Zelda lifted her head to look one of the champions in the eye. "I thought you..." Mipha took 2 timid steps forward. "Well, I'm not sure how to put this into words. I'm actually quite embarrassed to say it." A faint blush brightened her cheeks. "But I was thinking about what I do when I'm healing. You know, what usually goes through my mind." Lifting her head to meet Zelda's gaze, she offered a warm smile. "It helps when I think about..." She stopped herself suddenly, shaking her head and blushing harder. "When I think about the people I love." Suddenly, a fierce tremor shook the ground, sending rocks and boulders tumbling down the hillside. Zelda's eyes widened as she struggled to maintain her footing against the sudden onslaught. Link's firm, gentle hand on her arm kept her from toppling to the ground, though she still struggled to remain standing. After several seconds, the rumbling ceased. With a gust of wind, Rivali flew into the air, raking the landscape to find the source of the disturbance. Beside her, Daruk's booming voice echoed up to him. "What do you see?" As quick as he had flown up, Rivali flew back down, landing lightly on his feet. He spoke with urgency. "Strange red lightning appeared in the sky over Hyrule Field, and there are landslides all over. The wind, it doesn't feel right." Rivali looked nervously to the princess, her stomach dropping like a lead weight at the news. Rivali was many things. Talented, boastful, self-assured, but never nervous. "I have a feeling we are running out of time." Any despair Zelda had previously been feeling was quickly replaced by a frenzied anxiety. It was coming. "Hey, Mipha gave me an idea," boomed Daruk, turning to face her and briefly drawing her attention away from her rising panic. "Why don't you and the little guy visit your mother in Castletown? I know you mentioned once how much she meant to you, and it's from her you inherited the sealing power, right? And I'll bet in all this you haven't had much of a chance to think about your loved ones. Maybe that will spark something." Tongue-tied with too many emotions, Rivali beat Zelda to a response. Well, I guess it is a plan, something the princess hasn't tried before, and all conventional options have been exhausted. Zelda's gaze swept across the transformed faces of her friends before her. Daruk's idea had given them hope, a direction, determination. That was all she needed to see. I'll do it. She had to do something, and it might as well be this. It's settled, Urbosa announced, her bracelets jingling as she gestured to the princess and her knight. You two head out. Travel quickly. The rest of us will head back to our divine beasts. I suspect it won't be long now. Yeah! Zelda urged her horse onward, despite the aching of her muscles and the tears streaming from her eyes as the chill morning air whipped against her face. She and Link were nearly to Castletown, having ridden straight through the night. She hadn't bothered to change out of her prayer dress, instead opting to grit her teeth through the discomfort of riding side saddle. Link had been willing to wait for her to change into her riding clothes, but Zelda refused, accepting only the offer of his Hylian cloak from his saddlebags for the journey to the Castletown graveyard. She had failed to unlock her sealing power, and time was rapidly dwindling. The fate of her people were worth the bruises later if it bought her the time she needed. The sun's early morning rays cast a dazzling blue-hued light over a dewy Hyrule field. The roads were relatively empty, with only the occasional traveler gawking as the princess and her appointed knight flew past, the heavy breathing of their horses mingling with the thundering of their hooves. As Link and Zelda approached Lon Lon Ranch, another tremor, this one stronger than the last, rumbled through Hyrule Field. Both horses whinnied in protest, stumbling and slowing in their strides, but managing to stay upright. Already precariously seated, Zelda clung desperately to the neck of her stallion, glancing over to ensure Link and Epona were managing. Link had a firm grip on Epona's reins in one hand, the other grasping the saddle for support. He turned his head to meet her gaze, expression filled with concern as he observed the death grip she had around Flint's neck. His eyes held a question. Are you okay? She nodded as best she could. After an uncomfortable number of seconds, the rumbling finally stopped, and the horses slowed to a standstill, panting heavily. Zelda struggled to regain her bearings, gazing toward Castletown as she tried to bring the trembling of her limbs under control. The walls were visible in the distance. So, too, were the panicked movements of the Castletown guard, forming a perimeter around the city. After several moments, guardians began to join them, crawling their way across the field from the west, their glowing blue eyes swiveling. Zelda pulled her gaze away from the sight and turned towards Link. Do you think it's safe to continue on horseback? Link stared at her thoughtfully a moment. I don't know if another earthquake is likely before we reach the graveyard or not, but if we have to slow to a trot, the horses will still move faster than we will. Zelda nodded her agreement, then turned her vision to the road and flicked the reins. She risked a canter. They rode in silence. Zelda's mind was whirling with too many thoughts to carry on a conversation anyway. What were they to do if she couldn't unlock her sealing power in time? If the text were to be believed, her power was the final piece, arguably the most important piece, necessary to defeat Ganon. The wisdom and understanding needed to awaken and control the legendary sealing power of the Princess of Destiny was passed through the female line of the royal family of Hyrule. But her mother's death had been sudden and unexpected, when Zelda was much too young to receive this wisdom, though plenty old enough for her death to leave a deep and painful wound upon her heart. And so her training was guided instead by the ancient texts, translated from ancient Hylian by the castle scholars, but the information had been vague and incomplete. Prayer will unlock the power to seal Calamity Ganon, she had been told, yet prayer had done nothing. The graveyard loomed before them, its expansive rows of headstones and statues rolling on into the distance, dotted by trees and woven with unkempt dirt paths. All too quickly, Zelda was pulling her horse to a stop before the stone archway leading to her mother's walled-off section of the graveyard. Link had already dismounted and was standing beside her with his hand extended. Wordlessly, Zelda grabbed it, sliding off of her saddle and onto the ground. A knot of nerves made her stomach churn. She had to have faith. It It was just like Urbosa said, anything could spark her power to seal Ganon away. Closing her eyes and taking a steadying breath, she walked forward. She needed to focus. Her mother's mausoleum was near the rear of the plot, surrounded by blue nightshade, her mother's favorite flower, and shaded by a large oak tree. Sunlight illuminated a relief of the Hyrulean royal crest, which graced the archway above the mausoleum's entrance, though the high walls surrounding the plot kept much of the structure in shadow. Wrought iron gates enclosed her mother within, a small latch keeping it sealed. Zelda's chest tightened. She hadn't been here since Link had drawn the Master Sword and sealed their fates. How fitting that now, at the edge of annihilation, she should return to pay what could be her final respects. Hands on the gate, she hesitated, her doubts returning. What if this didn't work? What if she failed yet again? What if this only wasted precious time? Removing one hand, she turned slightly to see Link standing close behind her. Uncertainty etched her features, but Link's eyes held no judgment, only silent encouragement. There is always the chance that the next moment could change everything, he echoed quietly, repeating her words from weeks prior. For the first time since coming down the mountain, a small, genuine smile bloomed upon her face. "Thank you, Link," she whispered. With trembling hands, she unlatched the gates and walked inside. There were high windows on all three walls of the mausoleum, decoratively filled by wrought iron filigree, allowing in light and air but barring intruders. Despite this, the air was still and somewhat stale. Though the room was dim, Zelda could make out her mother's stone coffin, engraved with her name and the royal crest, resting in the center of the room. Nervous but determined, Zelda approached and knelt, elbows coming up to rest atop the stone surface, hands clasped. Closing her eyes, she spoke barely above a whisper. "Mother," she exhaled slowly, gathering her courage. "Mother, I am lost. When I was young, you told me of how grandmother could hear the voices of the spirit realm. You told me that someday your power would develop within me as well. But," her voice cracked. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Mother, I have failed. I have spent every day of my life dedicated to prayer, and I have achieved nothing." She subconsciously squeezed her hands tighter, feeling her fingers pressed tightly against her knuckles. "It comes, Mother." A shudder passed through her. "The signs are unmistakable. Link and I, the champions. How can we possibly defeat Ganon if I am unable to seal him away?" Her eyes misted, and her next words came out choked, but she forced herself to say them anyway. "I am so afraid, and I miss you so much." She could feel a single tear trail down her cheek, but ignored it. Breathing deeply, she willed the pain in her chest away. Gripped by a sudden urge, Zelda slowly opened her eyes and glanced briefly over her shoulder, to see Link standing guard before the gates of the mausoleum, back to her with the sheathed Master Sword resting vertically atop the stone floor of the mausoleum entrance, just as he'd been as she'd prayed at the springs of wisdom, courage, and power. She felt a brief flutter before pushing it away and refocusing her attention on her prayer. In a clearer voice, she continued, "Mother, I pray for your guidance. I have given every ounce of prayer and dedication to the goddess, yet my pleas remain unanswered. I know not what I have done wrong, but you are all I have left. I beg you, please, help me." As sudden as the others, a violent tremor shook the ground, and from the distance came an ear-splitting crack, echoing across the land as though the very heavens had been rent in two. The booming sound of thunder followed soon after. Though she had been kneeling, the force of the shaking threw her to the ground, a loud gasp escaping her lips as her hips slammed hard into the stone floor. Zelda's heart was in her throat. Looking towards the entrance to the mausoleum, Link was on all fours as well, Master Sword secured to his back as he made his way towards her, body lurching with each spike and vibration. Upon reaching her, the quake stopped. But it wasn't the same as the others. A charge filled the air, electric and foreboding. Dread welled up within her as she looked to Link. He could feel it too. Link pulled himself up on one knee, extending a hand to help her stand. Though his expression was serious, his eyes gazed upon her with concern. "Are you all right?" Heart hammering in her chest, she wasn't sure she could trust her voice and simply nodded, accepting his proffered hand as she lifted herself onto shaky legs. Another boom echoed across the sky, followed by another sound, fainter, slowly rising and difficult to discern through the walls of the mausoleum. Glancing towards the gates with trepidation, Zelda walked through the archway and out into the open air, Link following close behind. The sight that greeted her caused her breath to catch in her throat. In the distance, above the castle, bloomed thick, dark clouds, pulsating with a sickly red glow, slowly expanding outward as lightning of the same eerie red discharged from the unearthly mass. One of the bolts struck the tallest tower of the castle, sending rubble tumbling to the ground. Thunder boomed again, and the very air seemed to shake with the force of it. But what caused Zelda's limbs to tremble and her heart to thud painfully against her rib cage was the massive black entity, like sulphurous smoke, trailing behind an enormous, monstrous face, framed by long, thick horns with a cackling, sinister grin set beneath glowing, unforgiving eyes. It circled the castle like a cat stalking a mouse hole, awaiting the return of its prey. Opening its giant maw, it released a blood-curdling roar. Zelda shuddered. Now outside the protective walls of the mausoleum, Zelda registered the faint noise she'd heard from within. They were screams. The screams of her people. She felt her arms raised to her chest protectively, terror slowly filling her. A raindrop landed cold against her cheek. Looking up, she could see the clouds had reached the graveyard at last, blocking out the growing morning light. Turning her gaze back towards the horrifying image in the distance, she felt words leave her lips before she registered saying them. "It's awake. Ganon, he's here. I'm not. I didn't." Her voice was breathy and laced with panic, but her meaning clear. Her transfixed gaze was suddenly broken by her knight, who had moved in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Princess, we need to go." Zelda didn't respond, gazing at him with confusion as her brain struggled to process the chaos breaking out around her. More raindrops landed on her face and arms, and distantly she registered Link gently shaking her. "Princess!" It was here, Goddess, it was here, and she had no way of defeating it. "Zelda!" That got her attention. He had never called her by her name, despite spending the past several months insisting he do so. She felt that same flutter in her chest she'd had earlier, and her attention came to rest squarely on him. "You need to leave. Head to Kakariko. The Sheikah will keep you safe." His gaze was firm and focused. If he felt any fear, it was well hidden. Determination and commitment to duty were all that colored his features. Suddenly, things seemed to click into place, and she knew what she must do. Determination flooded her as well, strengthening her resolve and giving her courage. Squaring her shoulders, she looked at him firmly. "No, I will not leave you to face the Calamity alone. I may not be of much use on the battlefield, but there must be something I can do." "Princess, you can't—" "No, Link! I will not run and hide like some damsel in distress," she stated with finality. Though she was adamant in her decision, so too seemed he. "Zelda," he spoke firmly but patiently, "you are the only heir to the throne. If something should happen to the king, you are all that's left to take his place. I cannot risk your life." Frustration gripped her as she pulled her shoulders from his grasp and gestured with her free arm toward Castletown. "Do you hear that? Those are the screams of my people whom I have failed." She desperately hoped he didn't notice how her voice cracked, and pushed on, her volume rising with the tide of her emotions. "I refuse to be so selfish as to hide from my destiny, hide from my responsibility for the safety of this kingdom so I can cower in the safety of Kakariko while my people die alone." Shock covered Link's face, but he schooled his expression quickly, dropping his hand from her other shoulder to observe her critically. An idea suddenly occurred to her. Turning and striding purposefully toward the saddlebag of her horse, she pulled out the Sheikah slate, opening to the page displaying the runes. Returning to where Link remained standing, she held it aloft for him to see. I may not be able to wield a blade, but I can still be useful. Turning the screen back towards herself, she activated the Magnesis rune and levitated a shallow metal offering dish sitting before a nearby tombstone, deftly manipulating the Sheikah slate to send the bowl flying at an oak tree, embedding it in its trunk like a shuriken. She turned back to gaze at Link triumphantly, knowing she had won. In a tone that brokered no argument, she said all she was going to say on the matter. I'm coming with you. The rain was falling harder now, and she struggled not to shiver as she held herself with all the authority she could muster. But there was defeat in Link's eyes. He looked at her steadily for several moments before sighing and nodding, and she felt victory bolster her resolve. But as she made to move towards her horse, he stepped in front of her, barring her path, his expression steely as he held her gaze. If things take a turn for the worse, you must promise me you will leave and seek shelter. Zelda made to argue, but Link held firm, interrupting her before she got words out. No arguments. That's my condition. Holding his gaze, she relented. All right. Yes, agreed. He stepped out of her way, allowing her to reach Flint and hop atop his saddle. Turning, she reached into her saddlebags and pulled forth a short length of rope, tying it around the handle of the Sheikah slate and slipping it around her neck like an oversized pendant. Next to her, Link had mounted Epona, his gaze on the unsettling vision of Ganon circling the castle. Another roar echoed across the plains, drowning out the sound of pattering raindrops and sending shivers up Zelda's spine. Link turned towards her, their gaze meeting. He was determined and focused, but in his eyes she could also see the same thought passing through his mind that passed through hers. It was time to meet their destiny.
You did it!
I did it!
I really hope that Craig doesn't have any problems with that and that was okay. Because I don't want to have to make you do that again, but we'll see when I start editing tomorrow.
I figured out what we do battery.
It's gonna be okay. Oh yeah, you do that.
We're good. We're good.
Okay. So good job. I feel like whether or not we re-record that, like, I really liked the way you were, like, acting. Like, you were talking about earlier how you were listening to earlier podcasts and how they were doing voices, but you were doing it too.
Oh, thanks.
That was pretty cool.
I always enjoyed that when I was a kid, and I've worked in theaters and read to enough children that that's kind of habit now.
Great. Okay. As I mentioned before, I have 5 questions.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm ready.
So the premise of the fic has similarities to the story in Age of Calamity. You pursued it way better because of your attention to pacing. So I'm wondering how you went about ensuring how perfectly nothing was rushed and how every moment happened naturally and creatively at the same time.
Oh, that is a question.
And before you answer, I'd like to say to the audience that we're now going to be discussing the entirety of the fic that's been posted so far. So there's 30 chapters out so far, and we're going to be discussing all of that. So if you don't want spoilers, then turn this off and go read it. Okay, now you can answer.
And Godspeed. Oh, that's a question. Okay, so I mentioned before we started recording that when I first started outlining this fic, I did well into the early morning. It was 30 chapters, and I thought to myself, oh, wow, okay, this is perfect. Like, if I pace them out this way and each chapter's about this many words, like, I'll be done in a year at most. And now we're, 3 years later, and I have it broken up into 3 books, the first book of which is going to be 5 chapters. So you can see how well that worked out. But I guess as far as trying to get it to progress naturally, I have something of a background in mental health and psychology, general anxiety, and so a large part of this fic for me was sort of getting to elaborate on some of my experiences with those types of things. Like, a large part of the first 10 or so chapters has to do with kind of working through her guilt and anxiety and just general stress overall of the kingdom. And I kind of went step by step, I guess. I would write a chapter, write the next chapter, read it, write the next chapter, read it. And then once I had like 5 chapters, I'd kind of go back and look through all of them and be like, does this feel right? Does this feel natural? Does this feel aligned with some personal experience? And I think that's probably, I guess, what helped me do that. Giving myself room before publishing, so I didn't write myself into a hole. That was definitely one big thing, because I had, as I do with most of my fiction, I like to try and keep like 3 to 5 chapters ahead of what's actually published. So I need to go back and kind of adjust things for pacing. The way I outlined it as well was helpful with that. I kind of broke it up into different segments. So like there was, Zelda's sort of personal development arc, and then Link's personal development arc, and then development arc as a unit, as heroes of Hyrule, right? And so it was kind of like it helped, to block it up that way, both for like the logistical writing purposes. Obviously, if you're too much plot at once, it can get really hard and a little bit confusing, even for the writer. So that helped. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. It does. You pay attention to the psychology in it and how slowly that development can be, because like realistically mental health, like it's not a one night battle. And then you also outlined a lot, so, and paid attention to people's arcs, which they all went, they even though they were separate arcs, they all smoothed into each other really well, and so I thought that was really well done.
If there was any like one thing I could say to, I know that there's a combination of readers and writers who listen to the podcast, but if I could say any one thing to writers, it's definitely give yourself publication room, right? Like give yourself a chunk of chapters that are unpublished that you can still kind of fiddle with, right? I can't tell you how many times I've gone back, even on the night of publication, to change something before it's published, because like I realized like, oh, the pacing on this further down the road isn't right, or I need a little more foreshadowing on this to make it feel like it flows more naturally and doesn't come out of nowhere. And that definitely. And also, I had a wonderful beta reader for the first 20 chapters. It was wonderful in providing feedback as well.
So your advice is to kind of create a buffer so that it can seem more consistent. And what I usually do, and I don't want to talk about myself too much, but
go for it.
What I've gotten in the habit of doing, and I don't know if it's the best thing, maybe there's a balance between writing and posting, and then what I did, but with A Moment Beyond, I wrote the entire thing before even posting the first chapter, just to try and create that consistency, and I think it went pretty well.
I commend you on that. I don't have quite that discipline.
It went well, but then I also like, I don't think people need to go to that extreme. So I think that realistically, have the outline done, but still have that buffer, maybe a few chapters, but the outline for sure should be done, so you're not just kind of like, okay, where is this going? Like,
I completely agree.
You should
that's definitely something.
The ending should be when you're writing basically the whole thing.
Yes, actually, and I do have, as way of an example, I do have the ending to Love and Time Until
Don't tell me.
figured out, and I actually have scenes in the last few chapters, draft stage. And I do think that helps a lot, right? If you are writing, it's good to kind of know the direction, the specifics of the direction you're going. If you've got a sad ending, you might add more happy scenes in the middle, or if you've got a happy ending, you might add more sad scenes in the middle to things out, or to elaborate on aspects of the emotional state that are present in the peak action, right? So definitely having at least an outline completely done, even super detailed, but something that serves a room.
Yeah, I get you. My next question, I feel like some of these might not make any sense, but hey, I absolutely love that Zelda could hear her people's pleas to Hylia. It's such a chilling and evocative detail. Do you think that Zelda was always the goddess Hylia, or she became Hylia because of her power awakening? That made no sense.
It makes sense. I'm trying to think of how to answer that, because that scene in particular, it's not like a huge spoiler or anything, but like it comes back around a bit later in the story. I don't want to elaborate too much.
It's like you like, okay, like with most of the shows I watch, like for example Ruby, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's still running, so like in between in the hiatus, like I'll be like searching for scraps of information, like trailers and stuff, and like, okay, I got this theory and this theory. Like I feel like you're in charge of one of my favorite shows, and I'm just like, oh, that's something. That's a theory. So it comes back.
Yeah, it does come back a little bit. There's and actually that's a plot point I started outlining and detailing only a few months ago too. So it's funny that you asked that, because that scene in particular has been on my mind. But I will just say that at least as far as Nintendo has said, the Breath of the Wild game comes at the end of the Zelda timeline, a merger of the two timelines. And so as far as the Breath of the Wild canon goes, I think it can be reasonably assumed one of two things: either Zelda is the goddess reincarnated, or that she is just the descendant, like the descendant of Skyward Sword HD came out. I don't think it's a particular spoiler to say that she would be great whatever granddaughter of Skyward Sword Zelda.
I see you there, avoiding these. Of course, you don't have to answer anything that you're like, that's a spoiler.
Yes.
So yeah, I totally understand that. So I'm gonna go on to the next question.
Okay.
You heard it here first, folks. More on Zelda and her power. I mean, that's reading through the fic. That's kind of a given, because a large arc over the smaller arcs is Zelda being like, I have these powers.
Yeah, like what do they do? What do I do with them?
These glass.
What can they do?
I'm gonna kill someone in my sleep. Okay,
Yeah.
anyway.
She's got a lot of concerns.
Yeah. I thought that was funny. She's like, I'm gonna hit someone with a chair, and Link's like, you're not gonna hit someone with a chair, or whatever it was. Link being the voice of reason. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna read a quote. Despite the rules and expectations of their respective stations, the relationship, whatever it was, simply didn't fit into the rules they were forced to play. I feel like I'm this is like an essay question, like I'm an English class or something, but because I put a quote in front of it. But okay, the Link is portrayed as a fated pairing in a lot of fics, but here in this beautifully written quote, you seem to suggest that their connection is something that goes against destiny. which do you find yourself leaning towards more when writing the Link? Like, do you lean towards them being destined, star-crossed, or them being just like saying screw fate and finding love without it?
Both. I take the third option, the harder option.
All right.
Both
Both.
in a way.
Oh,
As far as like the immediate social environment that I'm trying to depict in Hyrule in the story, there's very strict sort of social boundaries. That's kind of alluded to in some of the Breath of the Wild cutscenes and in some of the other material, like in the Making a Champion book. So there's there's in the cutscene, Rome talks about the gossip mongers and this like perception of her as a failure, and people talk about her in the court, suggestive of a very rigid, gossipy court with a very there's a distinct hierarchy at play, and I'm trying to depict that in the story, especially when you see a character like Freder. There's clearly like a caste system of a sort, and actually that that in later chapters, in greater detail. But so as far as the social environment of the Hyrule is concerned, they have distinct roles. Link is her knight. He is a member of the knight class, and the knight class has there's a ceiling to which they can socially rise, ceiling to which they can project influence, engage with people above them. Obviously Zelda is highest strata, and so as far as the social environment is concerned, they're nothing more than a guard working for his superior, right? And doesn't matter if he's been bestowed this sword, or that goddess, right? Like he's done his role, right? He completed his destiny. They defeated Ganon. And that's that. Like, back to being a guard, back to being a knight, right? Like, you're done. Like, obviously, with Zelda being a princess, she will continue to be above him. And so there's that aspect, which is that they're not socially perceived as people that could be together. And yet, there's this deep connection between them that they and only they are privy to. They feel that combination of sort of having this destiny thrust upon them and having to work together and having to learn to, kind of, learn each other's struggles and willing to see each other as more than just or more than just, wielder of the sword, right? And so there's these two contradicting factors at play. There's the society saying like, no, this is not an acceptable relationship. And then there's what they feel.
Right.
And I won't say where that goes. At least not yet. But so when you ask, is it a fated pairing? Is it a going against destiny? It's kind of both.
Okay.
They're going against the societal expectation while pursuing what's kind of what they feel, what's in their heart.
All right. That's a good answer. You are very smart.
Thank you.
Okay. So you seem to switch between the point of views of Link and Zelda as well as other characters. Was this a stylistic decision you made or an instinct that you just stuck with?
Both again.
That's a good answer.
I started and initially intended to just do Link and Zelda's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But as the story got larger and more complex and more detailed, I felt the need to convey information to the reader that was not privy to the characters Link and Zelda.
Right.
And that was where I started diverging into these other character perspectives. And as I diverged into these other perspectives, they themselves started becoming bigger characters. It is a little bit of one of the people say where characters write themselves.
Right.
And that's kind of started to happen. As far as the number of characters that have already had point of view chapters, Link, Zelda, Shredder, Pikango,
Dorian, Tracy.
Dorian, Tracy. We will also get a new character from Impa, if we haven't already. And that's about. There won't be more than.
All right.
As far as
Say
what
that
I've
now.
outlined. I don't quote me, things can always change, but that's as far as it'll go for now.
All right. We'll see about that. Okay. My last question. World building with one's own unique that's the wrong word that I wrote down. Okay, anyway. World building in general and making it your own, giving your own unique twist as an author is probably one of the hardest things in fan fiction, because fan fiction is based in an already built world or universe. How did you manage adding such perfectly crafted and believable details to the already established kingdom of Hyrule? Because one of the
Thank you. That's very flattering.
one of the best things you do a lot of good things. One of the best things you do is world building, but as my mind kept going back, oh, the world building so good, world building so good. Like, it's already the kingdom of Hyrule, and yet you put your own unique spin on the details that you added, that it just seemed like your own world, and it fit, though. And I'm gonna let you into the question. I'm guessing, but yeah.
Well, certainly I've spent a lot of time in the actual game, just like running around and like looking closely at like a brick to gauge its like, pattern, and like exploring the world to find all of these, tiny little ruins that aren't like named on the map. And then like I'm like, oh, this could be, so part of it was definitely like really digging into the game and kind of just like letting my imagination run wild. And the fact that I started writing this before Age of Calamity came out, I could really kind of imprint, my own thoughts onto the otherwise unnamed, unspecified details present in the game. So that partly that helped. Another part is, with some of the again, it's a little bit of the story itself thing. Where as I started going along, I really one of those people connections. I've held a lot of different types of jobs, and in many of them there was a lot of connecting disparate. I was journalism. I've done, like I said, kids. If when you're working with a kid with autism and they start crying over, a marker, you kind of have to like really think back and figure out like what triggered it, and really look at pieces at play and figure out like, okay, why are they bothered? And so it was kind of taking some of that, applying it to the story, to the game, and to my own imagination. How can I connect pieces, right? Like, okay, I need to get character A from point 1 to point 2. How do I do that? Okay, there's the reason to do that. How can I make that reason connect to something else so that it doesn't just come out of nowhere? And a lot of my giving myself, a buffer between chapters that I've written and the chapters that are actually published is giving myself room to do exactly that, is to go back through, like, okay, let's review this chapter. Here's character A doing this thing. How can we make that tie into the story, the larger plot point? Which is also how this ended up going from 30 chapters to like 90. but such is life. But a good example, for instance, is Link's parents. This is another thing we're talking about before we start recording. Link's parents did not have much of a role in this story initially. And as I started trying to develop Link as a character and help him move through his struggles and his thoughts and his position within this world, I started thinking like, okay, why does he have these fears? How did he end up in this position? How did he get started with the Hyrule army? Right? How was he discovered as a prodigy? What could we imagine about his father? Why was his father a knight? Right? And all these questions, which don't technically play a direct role in the story, but they influence, right, Link's. And so then, of course, as I started thinking about those things, I started thinking about Link's parents and how they would have influenced him as a character, and then they decided to hop into the story as well. So, does that answer the question? I'm sorry, I feel like I got a little bit off track.
It does. I get it.
But yes,
yeah.
As far as world building goes, it's a lot of minutia. And detail accounts for a large part of what is taken so long out for the story.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys. I will get more chapters out eventually.
I'm sure you will. I'll be waiting. You will be too. Okay, here I'm going to go on to the Tumblr submitted question. I'm going to read verbatim what it says so you can see them fangirling over you. OMG, so your next guest is Spicy Chestnut. Squeals in delight, jumps around, and rolls on the back like a happy panda. If you have not already recorded the episode, can I try to squeeze in a question for her? I have recently read on the AO3 Tumblr that several authors feel annoyed and under pressure when they receive too many subscriptions and comments. Does this apply also to Spicy, or does she find motivation interacting with readers?
Oh, definitely the latter. Every time I get a new comment, or like someone, especially when someone like really, goes into detail about like something that resonated with them, or story of them reading a particular, I just die. And I know a lot of fic writers feel this way, but I just die whenever I get someone who comes to the story fresh and leaves a short review every chapter as they read through, where they're like summarizing their impressions of the chapter and what they're looking forward to the next one. Like, my God, I do not have words to like what that feels like. And I absolutely do find motivation in that. I definitely don't feel like pressured if a story gets a lot of subscriptions or comments or something. And I haven't had a ton of experience, thankfully. I'm very grateful for this. I haven't had a lot of experience with people like leaving nasty comments or demanding comments or things like that. Part of that could be that I'm not really active on fanfiction.net, and I'm active on Tumblr and AO3. So when someone does leave a comment or subscribes or something like that, like it does definitely provide a lot of motivation. And sometimes that just alone gets me to set aside 10 a day to just open up the file and look over the story and think about it, maybe add a couple notes here and there. As we get into the fall, I'm getting busier and busier with work, so I have nearly as much time to write, and kind of a bummer, but I am trying to time where I can make it. And absolutely, subscriptions are wonderful, wonderful things. So thank you, everyone who commented on my stories. I do read everything. So reply to it. Really.
Okay. Your audio is a little spotty, but I hopefully Craig got that. I kind of understood it, and if not, I'm gonna put like in
too long. Don't read version is thank you everybody for your comments. I appreciate it.
Okay. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so on the podcast we have the hosts and co-hosts, when there are co-hosts, answer the question as well. My answer to this is I have no idea where the notion came from that fic writers are annoyed by comments and kudos, but
Yeah, I'll admit it is a wild thought.
we live for it. Like, we post something, if it doesn't get a comment or kudos within the first, 5 seconds, we melt into ourselves, and we think we're bad, we think we're horrible, we didn't do a good job, and the world is over.
The self-conscious.
That's exactly what it is. And then, of course, that's overreacting, but over time, I find myself frustrated when I put so much effort into something for people not to interact with it or be scared of interacting it, or for some reason, I write in order to instill emotion in you, and knowing that I affected you in any way is just so important to the relationship between reader and writer, because it makes me feel like I have done something. The way I wrote it was efficient enough to impart emotion, but then also that it worked. And then even if I didn't get any comments, then I start to think it didn't work. And even though that's great for me, because then I think to myself, okay, critically, what did I do wrong? I need to fix this. It's just, it means so much for people to comment on fics, and we are never annoyed. I get a notification on Tumblr or AO3 that someone said something, and I'm like, oh my gosh, my day is made, my week is made, my month. It's like just one comment,
Really.
and I'm just like, the angels start singing. I feel like I can write. It is a little bit selfish because it is validation, but it just means so much that we affected you. And I guess I don't really, I shouldn't say we. I don't want to speak for anyone, but it means so much that I affected you, and that something that I loved creating was loved by the audience that I am sharing it with. So that's what I'm gonna say.
I'm reminded of I wish I could remember it verbatim, but there was a Steve Jobs quote, something about you know the most remarkable thing experience is realizing that you can push at the world and leave an impression, or to leave a mark and see that it responds to your efforts, and that is a really remarkable feeling, to know wow, I wrote this thing and I put it out there and it made somebody cry, or it made someone laugh, or it made someone's day, right? That's powerful, and extremely validating, as you put it, Faye. It's a pretty wild thing to experience, and a wonderful thing to experience. Yes. And it is completely addicting. Oh, yeah. Which is why we fic writers are so adamant about our fic writing.
Yes. Okay. So, going back a bit to Love in a Time of Calamity, you normally, I've gotten in the habit of asking fic writers, what's next for you? What are you working on? And because most of the fic that I have been works, that are either one-shots or that have been longer works that are completed. But for you, your Love Until a Time of Calamity is far from completed, and so you are still in the process of posting it to completion. And of course, there's no rush, and you already mentioned that you are very busy with work. So, before we do your special
end of podcast surprise,
before we do a special surprise of your teasing of a new content, in the form of a live reading. What do you want to say to people that have been waiting for a new chapter since February?
Oh God, has it been that long? That's oh boy, that is not what I had planned. Um, thank you for your patience. Thank you for the rereads that many people have done. I'm sorry it has taken this long. The story ended up being way, way bigger than I had originally anticipated. But I am still committed to it. I do still work. Hopefully, even if it's just 10 minutes, I still work. And I wish I could give a date for the chapter. All I can really say is that it's slowly getting worked on. Hasn't been forgotten.
Has not been forgotten. You heard it here, folks. Has not been forgotten. I mean, I shouldn't be talking because I only read all of it like a couple days ago, so I haven't been waiting as long as all of you have. But I feel like I have. Anyway. Well, it's just they're so comfy together, and it's been the third night where they're like, he's like, yeah, this isn't protocol, but I'm here and I'm warm, and her hair smells nice, and I'm like,
well, on that note, that seems like a good transition
yes.
to the end of
I'm
podcast
gonna
surprise.
wear my headphones.
I had wanted months ago when I signed up for this podcast. I was like, oh, I've got like 3 months until I have my recording, so I bet I could get that next chapter finished. And unfortunately, that did not, because
Life happens.
Yeah, basically. But I did have the first chunk of the next chapter mostly done, and I wanted to at least offer a little something. So I'd like to read the first 1,000 words or so of chapter 31 of Love in a Time of Calamity. The chapter is called Never Judge a Bird by Their Feathers.
Uh-huh.
Alright, ready?
Yes.
Okay.
She stirred slowly, morning light filtering through the curtains and casting shafts of pale blue across the dark floor. She was warm, but not merely kept warm by the sheets and blankets. There was a warmth in the bed with her, a radiant heat pressed against her body. Drowsily, she clung to it, snuggling closer, fingers gripping at rough linen. Her nose burrowed into the fabric, riding the gentle rise and fall of the warmth beneath her cheek, breathing the familiar smell of grass and pine and the salty tang of sun-touched skin. She smiled, and reminded her of Link. Her warm pillow gently shifted, and she sighed with the movement. Link! Her eyes flew open, and immediately she fell preternaturally still. Literally, she took in the rough linen of the familiar undershirt beneath her face. The presence beside her, against her, radiating heat and offering such cozy comfort, was Link. Her arm was wrapped around his waist, his running beneath her, gently gripping her shoulder, her cheek pressed against his chest as if to listen more closely to his heartbeat. She was, for all intents and purposes, snuggling with Link. The night prior came rushing back, the dreadful nightmare which had summoned him to her room, her shy request for him to stay to keep the demons at bay. She couldn't recall when, precisely, she had fallen asleep, but clearly she had. They both had. Despite how warm she felt beneath the layers and pressed against Link's body heat, she could feel the hot blush coloring her cheeks and shut her eyes against the burn of embarrassment. She tried to keep still, fearful of waking him. Judging by the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, he was still sound asleep. Should she try and extricate herself and risk waking him? But if he awoke in her bed, with her long gone, surely he would realize what happened. But was that such a bad thing? After all, they had shared a bed together twice while traveling on the road without incident. This wasn't really any different, was it? Well, she hadn't awoken snuggling him at the stables, though. She carefully angled her head up, glancing up to his sleeping face. The furrow in his brow, which was so commonplace during his waking hours, was gone in his sleep. His expression was gentle, relaxed. She couldn't help a soft smile. He looked so peaceful in his sleep. How could she disturb him like this? A yawn suddenly crawled up her throat, stretching her jaw as it escaped. He shifted a bit, murmuring in his sleep, and she once more forced herself still. His hand at her shoulder pulled her a bit closer, and he burrowed his face against her hair as he readjusted himself. Her heart skipped a fluttering beat. Well, she was still a bit tired, and he was so warm, his hold so comforting. Perhaps she could just lay there a bit longer, give herself time to think about how best to address the situation. At the least, she could wait for him to pull away so that she could rise without stirring him. Yes, that was a good plan. She closed her eyes, relaxed her limbs, burrowed closer to his warmth, let her legs tangle with his beneath the comforter, and her arm wrap more tightly about his waist. Yes, just 5 more minutes. When she awoke again, she was alone. She extended her arm groggily as she turned on her side, searching for the body she remembered being there. The sheets were cool where he had been, a sign of how long he had been gone. A swell of sadness rose within her at this thought. She sat up in bed, blinking slowly as her muddled thoughts came together. She wasn't quite sure what time it was when first she awoke. Probably sometime around sunrise, if the faint light peeking through the curtains had been anything to go by. Judging by the way they now glowed a warm amber, though, the day was no doubt well past first light. How long had she slept in? She turned to dangle her feet over the side of the bed, landing lightly on the rug-strewn floor. The fire pit in the center of her modest room was smoldering warmly with fresh briquettes of blackened wood. She distinctly remembered the logs she had thrown upon it the night prior, nearly burned to ash by the time she dozed off. Her heart fluttered a little. Had Link added fresh wood when he awoke? She crossed the room to the vanity, settling down upon the stool before it. Her hair hung messily about her face, and she marshaled it over one shoulder, reaching for the brush to begin smoothing out the tangles. It didn't escape her, as she gazed sleepily into her reflection, that her cheeks were tinted pink. She knew, in any other circumstance, what a breach of propriety and royal protocol their actions had been. But sitting as she was in a shaft of warm sunlight, the bristles of her brush gently massaging her scalp as she ran it down her hair, on the heels of a much more comfortable rest than the one she'd had before her nightmare, she couldn't seem to summon up the will to care. As before, at the woodland stable and at Snowfield, it felt like a practical choice, and a comforting one. There was nothing inherently wrong with 2 friends sharing a bed, after all. Travelers did it all the time. Besides which, he had told her all those weeks ago not to be afraid to ask for help when she needed it. And last night, she'd needed it. Needed him. She sighed, setting the brush down slowly upon the vanity as she chewed inside her cheek. They should still probably talk about it, though. Acknowledge it, at the least. Unlike at the stables, there were no extenuating circumstances to excuse their behavior. She had, quite simply, wanted his company in a capacity far more intimate than was appropriate for her station, or for his. She was sure he was fretting over the breach in protocol, no matter that she had asked him of it, no matter that he too had been tired last night. Yet knowing they needed to talk about it did not make the act any easier, nor the impending conversation any less awkward. She heard the clang of a pot lid beyond the canvas flap serving as her door, and startled, shifting in her seat to gaze curiously at the doorway. Despite her nerves, she smiled a bit. Of course. He had gone to make breakfast. She should have realized the moment she woke without him there that he had gone to seek food. With a little more confidence, she rose from her seat, turning to the small dresser beside the vanity. She would clean up and dress, and then she would walk out of her chambers calmly and confidently to confront the matter. She was the Princess of Hyrule, and he was her friend. There was nothing to fear. She could do this. so long as you didn't think about it too much.
I pressed end call instead of unmute, but every time you like paused, I was like, please keep going, and then you kept going, and then you paused that time, and I'm like, don't say anything, she might keep going, and then you're like, that's it.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay, you don't have to apologize. I completely understand. Being busy. But I'm gonna be thinking about her confronting him about this for a while. You gave me a good thing to think about. I'm gonna imagine so many scenarios in my head. Anyway, okay, that is a very good way to end off. Hopefully the audio was okay. And sorry to my audience about the lateness of these last couple episodes. It's just been a mix of technology issues and my new job causing scheduling issues. And even today we were supposed to have a co-host and Kip is MIA. I hope she's alive. I will update you guys in a couple weeks on whether or not she's alive. But
Fingers crossed.
if
Fingers crossed. It's all good.
she's fine. Then next week we have that G3 Obsessive with Great Expectations. It's set in Breath of the Wild, and I haven't read it yet because I read everything just before, but I'm sure it'll be great. And Obsidian will be back as the co-host, and I will let you guys know if Kip is okay. We sincerely hope she is. But yeah, this has been a really good episode. And I'm so glad that I've been introduced to this fic. And
thank you for reading
that I finally read something in Spicy's, because I've seen Spicy's name like around Tumblr for about a year now, and I'm like, someday I'm gonna read something from hers. And then I read this, and I'm like, okay, there's a reason that she's been floating around Tumblr, and everyone's been talking about Spicy, because it's really good.
me.
And I'm so honored that you, being such a big name in the community, signed on to this podcast. It's you and Ashley, where you guys came in and I was just like, excuse me? You guys know who I am?
We do, Fate. You will one day become one of us if you stick around long enough.
Anyway, so this is where we'll end it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for coming. Yeah, and anything else you want to say to the audience? You said a lot, but we like you talking. You can stay and read the rest of your fic. It's fine.
Like, comment, and subscribe. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, yeah. Like, comment, and subscribe. Yes, you can do that. This is on YouTube. Okay. In the description below, I'll have my information and Spicy's information and the link to this fic. That's the most important bit. So
this enormous unfinished monster.
All right. And so we'll say goodbye for now.
Goodbye, listeners. Thank you for listening.